What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with the Wednesday 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though, guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I went to college in a historic mid-sized city in Florida, and at the time lived in a duplex downtown, maybe about 3 blocks from campus or so. The city is known to be pretty safe, and I lived in a pretty decent area with large historic homes near me. It took place about 3 years ago. A little backstory that will become relevant. The duplex I lived in had a front door that locked, and then both the upstairs and downstairs units had their own locking door as well. I lived downstairs and had 2 roommates, but this specific night only one of my roommates was home. We knew the girls that lived upstairs, but really only spoke to them in passing. When they moved in, we emphasized how important it was to us for them to keep the main front door locked at all times. They always made sure to do a really good job of doing so. So, me and my roommate are in for the night, knowing the front door is locked and smoking a few joints. At some point, we hear a knock at the front door and quickly realize the girls upstairs must have ordered a pizza. Later on, we came to find that they'd forgotten to lock the front door again after receiving that pizza. So, we finally go to sleep in our own rooms. Since I had a queen bed, I would often sleep with my phone and laptop right next to me in my bed. A couple of hours after I'd initially fallen asleep, I was suddenly woken up by something I didn't recognize at first. As I came to of it, I came to realize there was a man standing over my bed. As soon as I realized I was not dreaming, I noticed he was quickly moving my phone and computer off of my bed and moving my comforter as well, trying to climb in. I started asking the man who he was, what he's doing here. I was extremely confused and still groggy. I was also still slightly high from before I'd gone to sleep. The only thing he said to me, multiple times, was that he was just trying to get into bed. At this point, I began to panic, as my mind obviously went right to the worst. I was hoping that maybe my roommate had invited some random Tinder guy over and he'd simply gone to the wrong room. But the more I tried to question him, all he had to say was that he was going to get into bed with me. I did own pepper spray and a stun gun, but I had left them on a shelf that the man was right in front of, so there was no way I would be able to grab them without escalating the situation. Realizing I needed to do something quickly, I blurted out, "There are 5 people who live in this house, and if you don't get the fuck out right now, I will scream. They'll be here in seconds." Luckily, that was all it took to scare the man off. I don't know if he brought something with him or if he stole something from me, but I did see him grab at something in the dark and run out of my room. As soon as he left, I shut the door and locked it and tried to find my phone. I couldn't find it anywhere. Then I quickly realized that between my room and the front door was the room of my friend that was still home. As scared as I was in that moment, I was even more terrified that maybe the man had gone into her room. I grabbed my stun gun and my knife, counted to 3, and ripped open the door. I burst into my roommate's room, only to find her fast asleep. There was no evidence of the man still being around. I quickly woke her up and told her what happened, and she asked me if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I even began to question myself until I walked out of her room and saw our front door wide open. I went to my room to search for my phone and finally found it, hidden under a pile of clothes across the room from where I'd left it earlier. That sent a chill up my spine, as I immediately knew for a fact someone had been in my house and room while I was sleeping. at least long enough to take and hide my phone. That only worsened my suspicions of his intentions. I ran back to my roommate's room, who at this point believed me. We barricaded ourselves in and called 911. Within minutes, there were cars swarming our street and yard, and they yelled for us to quickly leave the residence and run towards them. At least a dozen officers came rushing in and searched every inch of our apartment. We woke up the girls upstairs and searched their apartment as well to ensure the man had well and truly left. The officers had me write a statement, and I gave them a description of the man. To this day, I've never heard a single thing about the case. I just feel incredibly lucky with the outcome of the situation. The thought of his intentions terrifies me though, and additionally, the fact he was never caught scares me. I would hate for anyone to have to go through the pure fear I did. I will add there was a chance he might have been on drugs or mentally ill, and perhaps had no bad intentions. However, because he was never caught, I'll never be able to know. With the fact that he tried to hide my phone, I can only assume the worst. So I'm a pizza delivery girl. Easy enough. I was at work around 9:30 p.m. when this guy called in using a very whispery, breathy voice. I did my usual. "Thank you for calling Pizza Hut. This is Karen. How are you doing tonight?" After the usual exchange of small talk, I found out he was ordering for delivery. He was a new customer, so I had to put in all of his information fresh. I didn't notice anything weird initially. He told me he had a coupon for a pizza and asked if I could give him the discount. I told him I had to grab my manager so we could take care of that for him. He asked for me specifically to take care of him after I came back from dealing with my boss. I discounted him for his coupon and he thanked me. Here's where it started to get weird. He stopped me mid-sentence and told me I had a very nice-sounding tone of voice and he just loved to hear me talk. "You should be a disc jockey," he said. I was a little bit weirded out, but I tried to stay professional. I told him that was very sweet of him, and I would consider it in the future. "I'd listen to your radio station. Thank you for taking my order tonight. I'll stop by your store and see you sometime soon, Karen." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but that isn't true. I noted that this man lived in an apartment complex. What I didn't realize is I'd taken his complex's address and not his individual apartment number. Not 5 minutes later, the man called back and my coworker Bob answered the phone. I learned after the fact that he had asked for me by my full name. I picked up the phone and did my usual greeting, and he reminded me that I'd forgotten to ask his apartment number. I changed the information for him, but before I could hang up, this was our conversation. "Hey, Karen." "Karen?" Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "Are you doing all right?" "Yeah, I'm great." "Good. I'm gonna hang up now. See you soon." Bob had heard the whole story and told my boss to have my male coworker take the call instead of me. When Bob came back, the very first thing he said to me was that the man had been asking where I was the entire time. Okay, so I get there, right, and I knock on the door, and he says in this weird voice, "Come in." I'm not about to go into this random guy's house though, so I knocked again, and he opened the door with this big smile on his face. When he saw it was me though, it just dropped instantly. I greeted him and he said, "Oh, where's Karen?" I told him you weren't going to be able to make it, and he got so angry. After I took his money and gave him his food, he asked how you were. I told him you were doing all right, and he just said, "Good. Karen is a sweet girl. Tell her I'll see her soon." The fact that he asked the driver to come inside and that he was expecting me really creeps me out. Maybe he's just a lonely guy who wants someone to talk to, but still, I'm gonna add one more creep to my list. I wanted to tell you the story of a friend of mine named Angel. Angel is 19 and was honestly one of the brightest, cleverest, and most bubbly people I've ever met. She was obsessed with true crime stuff. She loved that TV program CSI and wanted to join the police so she could get into the forensic side of investigations. She loved the idea of using science to catch horrible criminals but we never thought she'd end up being the victim of one herself. She had everything going for her in life, but then she met her ex-boyfriend Jay, and we saw a change in her right away. Jay made everything about him, and he abused Angel physically and mentally until she made everything about him too. She was miserable with him, but kept talking like he was just a tortured soul who needed a girl like her in his life to help fix him. We had to intervene time and time again to get her to see what a scumbag he was, who'd never be good for anyone. He was only ever interested in himself. It took ages to do this, but we finally managed to convince her to leave him. She told us all in a group chat that she'd finally told him they couldn't be together anymore. We were all so proud of her, but she also said that she was terrified of something he'd do to get back at her for this. As much as we knew that her dad, Patty, would never let anything happen to her while she was under his roof, we knew that he also couldn't protect her all the time. We knew that Jay was terrified of Patty himself, as they'd almost gotten into fights a few times before. Patty was way bigger than Jay and could easily beat the life out of him if it came to it, so he always stayed away from the house, just not far enough. I remember the day we found out that Angel was in the hospital. We were all hoping it wasn't anything serious, but then we heard she'd been hurt in a very serious incident. She'd fallen out of a van that was going down the highway somehow. We all just knew Jay had something to do with it. As it turns out, Jay had recruited the help of one of his friends. They'd waited in a van near Angel's house, waiting for her to come out. When they spotted her, Jay ran out, picked her up, then carried her to the van and threw her into the back of it. We still don't know what exactly went on inside that van. He insisted in court that he hadn't just thrown her out, but whatever he was doing or saying, it had scared Angel so much that she somehow found a way to open the back doors as it was running down the highway. She must have thought her only chance of survival was jumping out the back of that van. Some people say Jay pushed her out the back as a way to kill her, but at his trial, his lawyers were somehow able to prove that he had not pushed her, and all he wanted to do was keep her inside the van. He must have admitted to wanting to kidnap or scare her into getting back with him, but I know Angel. She wouldn't have done something so drastic without being scared for her life. What happened next made it clear to me that the justice system in this country is just completely broken, because the sentence he got was nothing of what he deserved to get. Recently, he got his sentence more than doubled after a big public campaign headed up by her parents. That's all good and everything, but it still feels like nothing, because Angel's life is basically over now. She suffered serious head trauma after falling and being pushed from the back of the van, and now doctors think she'll be potentially disabled for the rest of her life. We don't know if she's ever going to walk, talk, or eat by herself ever again. Basically a death sentence. But the sentence Jay originally was going to get? Just over 4 years. Can you even believe that? This guy kidnapped his girlfriend, might have actually thrown her out the back of a van going 60 miles per hour, basically ended her life, and he was going to get out of prison in just 4 years. That's nothing. The driver of the van basically didn't get punished at all, and he also deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. Angel once told me about a law in America where if someone dies while you're committing a crime, your charge automatically gets turned into murder. I personally think we should have something like that here too. It would make people think twice about doing things like kidnapping or drunk driving or anything that could end up ruining someone else's life. This happened 2 years ago now, but honestly, it feels like just yesterday that we found out Angel's life was over. This story took me quite a while to write out, as I'm not much of an author myself, and it's quite painful for me to relay. Hopefully, this will help someone though, as it's something I've wanted to share for quite some time. It involves 2 days in my life that I'd always thought were very fun, but somewhat weird, and how, when I grew up and was told what really happened, they've haunted me ever since. It all started when my dad's business partner came to pick me up from school one day. I knew him as Uncle Todd, and although I wasn't expecting him, I trusted him completely when he told me that my mom and dad were busy and he would be in charge of looking after me for a few days. I remember feeling kind of reluctant to get into his car for some reason. After all, mom and dad hadn't told me anything about this. I didn't really want to be away from them. But then he started promising me ice cream, a Game Boy, all this fun stuff. He also told me mom and dad had said I could watch whatever I wanted on the TV and that I was allowed to stay up until whenever I wanted to. Music to a kid's ears, right? So I got into his car and we drove off to his apartment, stopping to get some ice cream on the way. Todd was serious about the TV thing too, as he pretty much left me in his apartment on my own for hours on end. I remember he seemed to be very stressed out about something. I always assumed it was just grown-up stuff or something like that. I didn't really care much. I had all the Nickelodeon and McDonald's I could ever want. And that's how I spent the first night. It was also weird to me that Uncle Todd's apartment was so small that we both had to sleep in the same room. I still wasn't questioning anything though, because he was such a regular part of my life, and I trusted him completely. The next day, after more McDonald's and a bunch more Nickelodeon, Uncle Todd came back super stressed once again and told me to get into the bathtub. I thought he meant that I could take a bath or whatever, but that's not what he meant. He walked me over to the bathtub and made me get inside without any water in it and without taking my clothes off either. I could then hear him talking into the phone in the other room, trying to keep his voice down. I could still hear, though, how angry and stressed out he seemed to be at the person on the other end. Eventually, he went silent, put the phone down, and went to grab me out of the tub. I remember him putting me back on the bed and telling me he was going to get more McDonald's and ice cream for me. Then, as he went to walk out of the room, he picked up this pokey-looking thing in his hand, obviously to take out to his car. I remember asking him what that was, and he told me it was a thing for getting his car started on cold mornings. It hadn't even been that cold that morning or the morning before, but hey, at that age, grown-ups know best, right? Anyway, a few hours later, he drove me back to my parents' place, and they gave him a present for looking after me while they were gone. My mom and dad seemed really happy to see me, and I was really happy to see them too. They said they missed me, and I missed them a bunch as well. I didn't really think any further into it than that. It was only when I was all grown up that I was finally told what actually happened. You see, Uncle Todd and my dad really were business partners, but my dad was not exactly a good or honest person. He'd actually stolen a bunch of money from their business out from under Todd's nose, and he'd actually tried to rearrange some accounting so Todd wouldn't notice either. But Todd did notice, and he got very angry about this. He told my dad to give it back, or he was going to call the cops. My dad told him he'd already spent the money, and if he called the cops and got him thrown in jail, he was never going to get it back. Pretty scummy, I know, but my dad is generally an awful person all around, so I won't go too far into that. Either way, Todd turned out to be way more of a psycho than my dad figured, because instead of calling the cops and getting him arrested, he came up with another plan to get his money back. That's how he ended up showing at my school and convincing me to get into his car. My dad tried to give Todd all these promises that he'd pay him back and get all squared off, but Todd wouldn't believe him. He wanted his money back and he wanted it soon, so he grabbed me and let my mom and dad sweat it out for a day. He told them that if they didn't give him the money in 24 hours, he was going to kill me. Not exactly the best plan. But like I said, Todd was kinda psycho. He fed me McDonald's, gave me ice cream, and let me watch as much cable as I wanted to keep me from leaving what turned out to be the motel room. That's why, for the longest time, I thought motels were places people actually lived, and not places where people only rented a room for a few days or whatever. Then there's the whole bathtub thing. Todd put me in the bathtub that day and brought an ice pack because he was going to torture me while making my parents listen on the phone. That was what made them finally break, and they ended up selling a bunch of things and doing other shady stuff in order to get 10 grand worth of cash together in the space of a day. When they called to say that they had the money, Todd finally took me back home and grabbed the cash, which I'd thought was a gift for taking care of me. and then we never saw him again. Mom and Dad got a divorce not long after, which was sad, but a few of my friends' parents had gotten divorces too. I knew it was a thing that moms and dads occasionally did. I had no idea it was because of all the stealing and the kidnapping. It was also because Dad basically refused to go to the cops about what happened because he was too scared of going to jail himself. My mom just completely resented him after that. She also told me my dad told her if she tried to press charges against Todd, he was going to tell the cops she was in on the scam or whatever, and she would end up catching charges as well. Sometimes I think she might have actually been part of it, and that's why she didn't go to the cops right away when she found out Todd had taken me. I don't know, a lot about the story doesn't add up, but since I don't see my dad anymore, and my mom is the only member of my immediate family I'm close to, I don't exactly want to confront her about it. So, yeah, that's the story of my super messed up family, and how one of the weirdest, most fun times in my childhood turned out to be something completely horrible and kind of dramatic, honestly. In hindsight, it seems really scary, because I had no idea what was happening. It all seemed completely innocent, but I was minutes away from something out of a living nightmare, with my Uncle Todd doing all kinds of evil stuff to me in that bathtub, making me scream into the phone for my parents to hear. Let me start off by saying I'm a 16-year-old male and an only child who lives in a quiet rural area surrounded by fields in Amish country. I'm going to use the alias John for this story. One Saturday evening, after an afternoon of occasional rain showers, I was home alone while my parents were out for their anniversary. They had just recently left to go out when I decided to take a walk now that the rain had stopped for I don't know how long. I go into my garage, slip on my shoes, and head on out our sliding back door in our kitchen. The backyard was large and fenced in, as we used to have some dogs. There was a gate in the fence just off the patio that leads to our underground swimming pool, then another that leads into the side of our yard. I exited through there and headed down to my driveway and onto the road. I was out for maybe an hour or so when I finally returned from my rather simple exercise of walking up and down the road while waving to any friendly neighbors I saw. I walked towards my side yard when I noticed that the gate I'd exited out of earlier was still open. I must have forgotten to close and secure it, I thought to myself. It was a bit windy that day, so perhaps the wind had opened it up because I'd forgotten. Oh well. I headed through the gate, through our pool area, back onto the patio, and in through the sliding glass door. Later on, as the night began to set in further, I had just finished baking and eating half of a frozen DiGiorno stuffed crust pepperoni pizza when I heard one of the fence gates slowly creaking open. Obviously frightened, I thought at first maybe it was my mom or dad coming home early. They'd always call me when they were on their way home from wherever they were at though, so that surely couldn't have been it. I ran throughout the house and locked every door and window. I waited and listened in my kitchen for any further suspicious sounds. After about 5 minutes of not hearing anything else, I thought maybe it had just been my imagination, or maybe I'd again forgotten to lock the gate on my way in and the wind had blown it open again. I decided to quickly head outside and check it out. By now, it was completely dark and cloudy, so I grabbed a flashlight out of a drawer in the kitchen and crept out the front door. Once I was out on my driveway, I shone my flashlight down the side yard towards our shed. Okay, nothing there. So far, so good. I walked down the side yard slowly and was pointing my flashlight in every direction, keeping myself aware of my surroundings. Once I finally crept up to the gate, I saw it was wide open. Must have forgotten to lock it again, I thought to myself. I face-palmed. I shut it and locked it, then turned around to head back towards my driveway. All of a sudden, though, I noticed something out of the very corner of my eye in the darkness. My heart dropped as I shined my flashlight quickly towards my backyard and caught a glimpse of the backside of somebody walking behind my shed. From what I saw, I could make out that this was a person with dark hair wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants, and they appeared to be carrying something in their left hand. I could just barely make out what appeared to be the blade of a knife or some sort of small, sharp instrument. At this point, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to confront this person or go inside and call my parents. I stood frozen for a few seconds, hand trembling, as I finally decided to call my mom. After 2 rings, she picked up. "Hello, John. You need something, sweetheart?" she asked. I felt a bit more comfortable now. "Yeah, Mom, I think there's someone in our yard," I said, taking a deep breath. My mom gasped, and her voice got a bit frantic. This was the first time something like this had ever happened. "Where are you now?" I continued looking out towards my shed, now lit up by the flashlight. I could no longer see the person anywhere. "I'm out on the driveway. I heard the gate open and went outside to check it out. I saw someone. He was walking toward the back side of the shed and carrying something. I think it's a knife or something like that." My mom gasped again, and this time I heard my dad ask what was wrong. She told him what happened as I stood there and eyed for any movement. "We're heading home right now. Call 911. Don't go chasing him or anything stupid like that." "All right, Mom. I'm going back inside right now." After exchanging our farewells, I turned around to rush back into the house. Once I turned the corner to head back to my front door, though, I saw somebody walking down the road right in front of me. My heart sank as I stood there in shock, ready to flash my flashlight at whoever this was. The person stopped walking and stood still for a couple of seconds before slowly turning their head in my direction. They must have heard me walking as well. I instinctively whipped the light up and shined it at the person's face. It was a male, I don't know how old, dressed in a black zip-up hoodie and black sweatpants. No doubt it was the same person I'd seen behind my shed. I could only see one of his eyes, as the other was completely covered by something. He looked at me with this blank, expressionless face. It almost felt like he was glaring directly into my soul. This time, I didn't see his knife, but he did have his hand in his hoodie pocket. Without a single word or facial gesture, he slowly began to walk backward before turning around and continuing down the road. After a few seconds, I ran up the road in front of my house and peered down it. I didn't see him anymore. He must have entered someone else's yard. I ran back inside and waited for my dad and mom to get home, as I called police in the meantime. Once a state trooper arrived, I told them everything, from the gate being fondled with to the encounter I'd had with him in front of my house. The trooper told me there had been several calls in the past few months about a person matching that description I gave them, being spotted in several different areas, acting very suspiciously. That interested me greatly, I must say. I tried to ask him more about it, but he declined to answer. Once my parents arrived, they talked with the trooper a bit before he finally left. Afterwards, my parents and I talked about what happened before sitting down to watch a movie, which made us all fall asleep together. Nothing much changed after that night, though. I still live here, and my parents still let me stay home alone, but we've gotten a home security system just in case, and I'm more vigilant whenever I'm by myself. Once, when my cousin and I were in our younger teens, we would get bored and would wander around our neighborhood looking for things to do. This one particular night, though, we came across this house that was not very well taken care of and seemed to be completely empty. Years before, the people that lived there were very active, growing gardens and raising animals on the property. But for a while now, it sat completely empty and abandoned looking. There were never any cars or any people around the property at all. Because of this, that night we decided to go check it out a bit further. We started by jumping the fence and wandering around the yard looking for any valuables left behind. Honestly, it looked like a junkyard to us. We wandered over to this empty camper and walked inside. We looked in through the cupboards, peeked through the doors, and checked under the cushions, but we couldn't find anything interesting. Suddenly, we heard a small thump behind a garbage can. We were shaking, and didn't dare to check what it was in that moment. Out of nowhere, a black cat jumped up and out of the camper. We screamed like little girls. We decided to move on from that camper and go check the main house instead. It was for sure abandoned. We hadn't seen anyone there in months, if not years, and we checked often. We tried the front door, but it was completely locked and boarded shut, so we moved around to the side and tried the windows as well. They too were locked. Next, we tried the back sliding door, and to our surprise, it actually opened. Only a few inches though. There was a stick on the other side wedged between the wall and the door, so we had to reach in to try and move it out of the way. My cousin was already shaking and just wanted to go home. We'd gotten so far already though, why not have a simple peek? I wedged my head and arm inside and reached in for the stick. I just barely couldn't grab a hold of it. I pushed harder and further, trying to reach. Just then I heard a deathly scream, louder and more high-pitched than anything I'd ever heard. I heard a thumping rushing down the stairs. There was an old lady, not walking, not running, but charging at me. She'd come out of literally nowhere and with no warning at all. I tried to pull myself out, but I was completely stuck. My cousin abandoned me. He was already scared enough. I pulled with everything I had in me, scarring up my arm and almost ripping off my ear trying to get out. Just as I pulled myself out of the door, the old lady slammed face first into the glass door, banging her hands and head on it. She was screaming and yelling at me, words I could not understand. I ran half shaking and half numb. I'd never felt so lightheaded and numb in my life. My cousin and I asked around the neighborhood the next day, and we found from some old people living there that there seemed to be some crazy old woman living in the home that thought the world was soon ending. Because of this, she never came outside. She hoarded food and never left the house, living in fear of other people. She had no vehicles and lived alone as well. It appeared she had some sort of severe mental problem. The next day, when I was walking the neighborhood, I spotted a vehicle at her home and a man in her yard. I stopped and watched as the man pulled out 2 bulldogs. I assumed she called someone because she thought we were trying to rob her. Honestly, I felt really bad about everything that went down. That was the day I learned that no matter how tempting it may be, or how interesting something looks, if it's not yours, then it's best to stay away. This story is about a bad experience I had when I went camping on the beach in the summer with my boyfriend. We had the nice idea of camping out on the beach instead of staying at a hotel, since I'd always wanted to sleep and hear the waves hitting the shore, see the night sky whenever I wanted, and just had this experience at least once in my life. We were supposed to stay in that tent for about a week. The area had a public restroom with some showers and some restaurants nearby as well, so the matter of hygiene and hunger were not that much of an issue. We bought all the supplies we needed for such an adventure as well. A 2-person tent which was blacked out, so the sun's rays couldn't come in, an inflatable mattress, first aid, lanterns, etc. The first nights were no issue. We actually enjoyed every moment of it. We would take all of our valuables with us in backpacks though, in case anything bad happened to our tents while we were gone. You know, phones, chargers, wallets. We weren't the only people with that idea, so there were other people camped in the area. There were plenty of people, either single, couples, or even families, and that included people that were behaving badly. When the night arrived, you would hear people laughing, partying, and dancing occasionally. Probably smoking weed, taking drugs, or drinking a lot of alcohol. We didn't really mind though. Nobody had bothered anyone for the past 4 days and nights. People were there having a lot of fun, as they knew best that no one was going to be aggressive. One night, we stayed out later than we usually did, around 1 a.m. just wandering around the lively streets to listen to the street performers, eating out and doing other such activities. That was when we stopped at one such street performer's corner, who seemed to have quite a lot of people circling around him and listening to his music. We realized soon, though, that he was not the main character people were gathered here for. Right in the middle of that crowded street, where cars were passing by often, was a middle-aged woman, dancing completely in the nude, clearly being affected by some kind of drug or alcohol abuse. She was completely incoherent. She would randomly expose herself to people while dancing to the music, despite the disgust of everyone around. We didn't look that much into it. We weren't really interested. We decided to go back to our tent and have a drink in silence while watching the stars and falling asleep to the sounds of the ocean. While drinking by ourselves, though, we could hear some woman shouting in the distance. We soon realized it was the same woman we had seen before. It seemed she wasn't alone. She had some friends with her, 2 other women. They had set up camp on the beach just ahead of us, a few tents further down. It was close enough that we could still hear and see them, even if it was dark. They lit a fire on the beach and continued to wildly drink and dance around randomly. Of course, she was still naked, but this time she was wearing a see-through skirt. She even went and dipped in the ocean for what seemed to be an eternity. I just remember thinking to myself, how can she not be cold? It must be freezing out here. My boyfriend just shrugged and told me not to pay attention to this girl. If we didn't engage with them, they wouldn't engage with us either. I did as I was told, but even so, I could feel their eyes watching us. Putting those thoughts aside, though, we decided to head to sleep early. It was a beautiful night and the air was warm. We decided not to close the tent completely, just zipping the mosquito cover so the air would still circulate inside and the sun would shine in the morning to wake us up early. I don't recall how long I'd been sleeping for exactly, but I remember suddenly being woken in the middle of the night by steps circling our tent and a woman's voice humming a song softly. The tent was not very thick, and you could hear everything outside of it. I was too afraid to look out. I was too afraid to even change my position, as I didn't want to indicate to whoever was outside that I'd just noticed their presence. All I could do was lay down and look out through the mosquito cover. All of a sudden, though, I heard the footsteps stop just above where my head was, and a voice whispering through the walls of the tent. "Don't be afraid. I'm just going to sing you a lullaby." The footsteps began to rapidly circle the tent. I could see feet in front just passing by, noticing the very familiar long see-through skirt billowing behind her. I stayed awake in terror, and the next morning we packed our tent in a hurry and moved to a different area, as far away as possible from that woman and her friends. This is more of a warning to people who live alone than anything else, but the memory of it still creeps the ever-loving shit out of me. A few years back, I lived in an apartment complex. It was not in a particularly bad part of town either. In fact, I'd lucked out even, somehow managing to move into the same building as a handful of friends of mine. I thought this was perfect. A couple of months after living there, though, I started to notice some things going missing. It was never anything big like my laptop or my Xbox or my TV. It would be smaller things. An iPod, a disposable camera, a couple of other small things just vanishing here and there. I'd often knew I'd left them out in the open on the counter or something, but then they'd just be gone. I figured I'd just misplaced them, because again, they were fairly small items. A few times I'd get ready to leave, only to find my bottom lock already locked. Now, personally, I don't put much stock in doorknob locks. They're fairly flimsy and easy to pick anyway, and not really worth the effort. I only really ever use deadbolts and the like. When people would come over, I'd close the door behind them and lock the deadbolt, of course. That was a reflex, even when I was home alone. That part of the door would be locked, but I'd never lock the knob itself, I just felt safer that way. The deadbolt had no keyhole on the other side of the door for someone to pick or anything like that, after all. 3 times I noticed the doorknob was locked when I went to leave the house, even though I myself never used it. I rationalized that perhaps when going to lock the deadbolt, I just locked that too out of instinct. I mean, what else could it be? Well, one day, after living there for about 7 months now, I'm just sitting there in my living room when I hear some shuffling by my front door. Since my apartment was a 1-bedroom and fairly small, I could easily hear this through the walls. I got up and moved a bit closer, standing maybe 4 feet away from the door. My heart immediately sank as I watched the doorknob begin to twist ever so slowly. It turned and turned, and then the door pushed in, only to be stopped in place by my deadbolt. At an agonizingly slow pace, the person on the other side of the door pulled it closed. They clicked it softly shut, and I watched and listened as they slid a key into my lock and locked the doorknob themselves. I didn't know what to do. Have you ever seen something that just restarts your brain? It's so unfathomable that you just can't take in any more information in the moment. That's exactly what this was. I wish I could say I snuck up to the door and banged against it, scaring the shit out of whoever was on the other side. But of course, that's not what happened. I didn't do anything because my brain couldn't actually comprehend that someone with a key was trying to get into my apartment while I was still home. The only thing that had saved me in that moment was my deadbolt. And before anyone suggests it was one of my aforementioned friends or my husband with a spare key or something, no, I had the only 2 copies of my key because my husband was deployed at the time. Not even my family had a spare. Everything sort of snapped into place after that. Someone had been sneaking into my apartment, stealing my shit and doing God knows what while I was gone, then locking the door behind them. They'd attempted to do this while I was there too, locking my doorknob. How many times had they been in my apartment when I wasn't home? There was no way for me to know, because like I said before, I can't lock the deadbolt from outside. Logically, I knew it had to be someone who worked in the office, a maintenance man most likely, but since I hadn't looked through the peephole in that moment, I couldn't figure out which of the 4 guys who worked there it was. Crazily enough, about 6 months after finally moving out, a friend who still lived there told me that all of the maintenance men had been fired because all of them were reported for creeping around apartments and suspected of stealing as well. While this might not be outright terrifying like some stories, it's still pretty scary. Another reminder to always lock your doors in multiple ways, even when you're already home. I'm of the mindset that everyone should know a little bit about cars. I've always been mechanically inclined, and I think that may have saved me this time. I was using dating apps a few years ago. Met this guy. He seemed super nice. We talked for a few weeks before I was willing to meet with him. His dad owned a local gun store where I would get most of my target stuff. I used to be in a women's league for competition shooting. I had seen this guy around before because of this and had a fairly decent impression of him. I still wanted to be safe though. He invited me out to a concert at a local town site. It was a concert I really wanted to go to, and I figured it would be safe as well. It was at a well-known place with a lot of security. I let him pick me up because he had talked about mechanics and cars and wanted to show me his Mustang. He liked to brag about how well he kept it running and how much he babied it. I was into time trial racing at the moment, so I was interested to see what he had done on it. He picked me up and we started heading to the event. Right before the exit, he said his car was suddenly acting funny. I was watching the dash though. If you've been in racing, you know our cars and trucks usually have extra accessories. Whether it's aftermarket racks and gauges or switches, there's usually something aftermarket inside the car. As I looked though, I noticed there was nothing extra. The car felt like it was shifting correctly. There was no shudder or noise, nothing to indicate any problems at all. I thought that was fairly weird. All I said was that we should try and limp it on over to the concert venue. It was less than a mile away now, and and it was better than being stuck on the I-15. He agreed and drove us very carefully the last mile. We get to the concert, and things were okay-ish. He kept on watching me and buying me drinks the whole time. I refused to drink, though. Every time he gave one to me, I would make up an excuse and go to the bathroom and flush it. He kept making comments about how well I was handling the alcohol, and I was getting super weirded out. The concert ended, and it was finally time to leave. For context, this particular event happened at the local reservation town site. At the time, the res did not have great cell service, so I couldn't get a hold of anyone to come get me. I decided to bite the bullet, and I talked him into taking the old highway instead of the 15. It sounds a bit silly, but when you take that old highway, even though it's slower, people seem more willing to stop and help you than they are on the freeway. I figured if he really was having car troubles, it would be a lot safer. Plus, we wouldn't have people flying around us at 80 miles per hour. We made it about halfway between the town site and our town when he said the car was acting funny again and pulled over. I was stone cold sober still, though, and didn't notice anything wrong. When I got out of the car to check it out with him, he started making comments about how I was so drunk and I should just wait inside. He even explicitly said, "It's safer because you can't trust drunk Indians, especially with a little girl like you." This dude had no idea that I was actually native myself. I just happened to be kind of pale. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, so I checked my phone. Just barely got a bit of service. I started to text my dad. As I was walking away from the engine compartment, I noticed that instead of looking at the car, he was now watching me. I started acting like I was trying to get cell service to get help. Out of the very corner of my eye, I saw this man take the spark plug wires off the distributor cap and switch the order. Your spark plug wires connect to the distributor cap based on the order your cylinders fire in, so doing this will either make the car run terribly or not even be able to turn on at all. I managed to send my dad a picture of what he was doing, and my dad told me to start walking. As I started to walk away, the man hopped back into the car and opened his glove box, which exposed the pistol lying within. He told me not to worry and said we would be perfectly safe. I broke a world record for how fast I was texting my dad. He said to start walking and to tell the guy that he was already on his way and that our friends lived just up the road. So that's exactly what I did. I started walking with a purpose and took off as quickly as I could. The man was yelling and starting to chase after me, but I yelled back that the wind was too loud and I couldn't hear him. I said I'd be back with our friends in a moment. I was scared out of my mind, though. We were 10 miles out of town with no one around. The closest road actually led to a cemetery, so no one was around to help me. I got a really bad feeling the farther I got from the car. I turned around and looked. The hood was now closed and the lights were on. I decided to hide in the farm irrigation next to the road. I kept walking towards town crouched down and texted my dad what was happening. I heard a car slowly come up behind me. Then I saw a flashlight. I pressed against the side of the ditch and waited for the lights to pass by. Once I couldn't hear anything else, I crawled out and kept walking amongst the weeds. My dad texted me that he saw me, so when he pulled up, I ran to his truck. As we made our way back towards town, we passed by that dude, and he was now surrounded by 3 cop cars. My dad told me not to worry much about what happened. I heard through the grapevine later he had been charged with violent crimes in the past, and he had been arrested that night for concealed carrying without a permit. The police never talked to me, but I haven't seen that guy in town ever since. If I didn't have experience with cars and didn't know what he was doing, I could have been dead in that ditch instead of hiding. Most communities have places where you can take basic car care and maintenance courses. I highly recommend everyone take them and at least know the basics. This dude knew I knew cars, but his whole goal was to get me so piss-ass drunk I wouldn't realize what was happening. Luckily, his fake car troubles didn't fool me. My family and I went on a trip to the Hocking Hills area of southern Ohio just a few weeks ago. There was a place I always wanted to visit. The abandoned ghost town Moonville Rail Tunnel. I had never been to this area, so I didn't know what to expect. I did know it was pretty deep in the woods though. We took a trip from our rented cabin, using Google GPS to get to the location. We started driving, and it was, for lack of a better word, a real impoverished area. It had a very hills have eyes-esque ambiance. We literally only saw like 2 cars on the way there, and on the back roads as well. We got to a point where we needed to enter the forest, and were close by to the tunnel. There was a sign that said we were entering Bubblewood. For a little more additional information, I drive a Mercedes that I'm lucky to have, and my husband was in the car. He's a black man with dreadlocks, and I had my 10-year-old nonverbal autistic son with me as well, and my 6-year-old daughter too. We drove down this real creepy stone road into the forest. There was nothing back there. No cars, no houses, not a single person. We did see signs we were close though, and pulled into the parking lot. There was a footbridge that people had built there. We walked over the footbridge and made our way toward the tunnel, which was a lot larger than I'd expected. All of a sudden, we heard this sound coming from the other side of the tunnel, into the woods away from the parking lot. A truck came driving towards us while we were on foot. The truck stopped in the middle of the tunnel. The person got out of their truck with a chainsaw. I could see it was a white guy in his 60s. He started to walk after my family, following us everywhere we went through the tunnel. I tried to call out to him and pull some info about if he worked for the Department of Natural Resources or something, but he wouldn't say a single word. As we turned around to leave, he started to rev up his chainsaw behind us. The sound echoed throughout the tunnel. At this point, we had no cell phone service, and literally no one knew my family was out there except for us. I was already worried my car might be sending the wrong idea to people, like we were some naive folks with money or something. We didn't have much. We rushed back to the car to get the kids in their booster seats. This motherfucker jumped back into his car and drove over the footbridge in his truck towards us, following us to the parking lot. Honestly, I don't even know how his truck fit onto that bridge. He stopped again and got out of his truck. About this point, I noticed there were some dusty handprints on my car. I asked my husband if they were his. We compared his hand and my son's, and they were not a match. I don't know who would have been touching the car, because we were watching the chainsaw man the entire time we were there. Needless to say, we got out of there as fast as possible. Just a few minutes later, though, I looked back into my rear view mirror, only to see a bunch of dust kicking up behind us. There he is. He had driven pretty fast on the stone road to catch up to us. There was nowhere to go in these woods. The road was basically one lane, and we still had no GPS. Every time I thought we would lose him, he would turn up behind us once again. I was just waiting for my tires to pop on a trap or something, or for this guy to speed up and ram me off the road into a ravine. Finally, we emerged from the woods. I turned around, only to see he was still following us. We were following printed directions to get back, and I ended up making a wrong turn in all the excitement. Surprisingly, the guy on the truck did not follow us. I turned around to go back past the stone road that went into the forest and take a different way. There was one lone house near this road, and to my surprise, I saw his truck parked right there. He had to have seen us drive into the road in the woods and taken some way back to the tunnel. I don't know if he was trying to protect the site from some graffiti or what, but that was really scary. It was like every scary movie trope rolled into one single event. My high school had this building that was closed down. We called it the old building, even though it really wasn't any older than any of the other buildings on campus. For some strange reason though, it was always closed down. The doors were all boarded up, and the students were forbidden to try and get into that building at all. The story that was passed down along all the students was that there was an old janitor named Mabel. He was a guy who worked in the old building. He was working late in the building one night when an escaped lunatic broke into the school. The lunatic supposedly killed Mabel by drowning him in the toilet. Afterwards, he took a hacksaw and hacked Mabel up into tiny pieces, then flushed him down the drain. Afterwards, they closed the building down because they didn't think it was right having children be taught in the same building in which such a brutal murder had taken place. Of course, as you might know, with urban legends, it doesn't just stop there. You know how kids are, not exactly original. There was this idea that if you went into one of the bathrooms in the old building and made sure all the stall doors were closed, then said Bloody Mabel 5 times in the mirror, Mabel would climb out of the toilet and murder you, then drag you down the drain. Of course, we knew the story was not true, but guys would often dare each other to go into the old building and do this little ritual. Of course, the day came along that I was dared as well by some old rivals of mine to break into that old building and try the ritual out. Unbeknownst to the faculty, the students had long discovered a way of getting into the old building through a busted window. Pretending to be brave but actually being quite nervous, I climbed in through that broken window. The old building seemed a lot like any other abandoned building you'd see around. It was quite unkempt in there. There was tons of graffiti all over the walls. Now, the lore was that you were supposed to find the boys' bathroom on the east end of the bottom floor. It wasn't very difficult to find, actually. There was a ton of Bloody Mabel graffiti on the wall. Well, as much as I could see with my small flashlight. I guess I should have mentioned it was dark out. I wasn't allowed to use a light when doing the ritual, though. I'm not particularly sure how anyone would know if I ever did, but I decided to play by the rules anyway. The middle stall door was already closed. I went over to the sink that was facing the stall, and then with a bit of a nervous chuckle, I began to say the incantation, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel, Bloody Mabel. As anyone would, I made sure to pause for a moment before saying it for the final time. With a deep breath, I said the final Bloody Mabel. I stood there for half a second, expecting something really to happen. Of course, nothing did. The bit of nervousness I'd felt in the beginning went away almost instantly. I actually felt really relaxed now. As I turned and walked back into the hallway, though, I found myself face to face with the nastiest looking man I'd ever seen. Standing there in dirty clothes, staring daggers at me right in the eyes. In shock, I fell back onto the floor. The man looked like some sort of vagrant, really dirty and unshaven. He didn't seem to have a weapon on him at all, but the sheer look on his face told me he was not pleased at seeing me there. Likely he was just a homeless man living in the old building, wanting to stay undetected. Now I had discovered his hiding place, and that was not good for him. I tried to get up, but when I moved, he loomed over me. I was scared. I had no idea what the man was going to do. He grabbed me and pulled me up. He shoved me against the wall hard. I remember it was so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I did the only thing I could think to do. It was automatic. I didn't even have time to think about it. I used every ounce of strength I had and kneed him right in the crotch. He buckled over, but surprisingly, he still didn't let go of me. I continued to knee him 2 more times. The man doubled over in pain, and I hightailed it out of the old building. My friends all noticed how disheveled I looked, and I told them someone really was in there. At first, they all thought I was just trying to scare them by claiming it was Bloody Mabel, but I explained what had really happened. One of my friends went and called the police, but when the police searched the old building, they didn't find anyone else there. Me and my friends were by the busted window the whole time, and we know the guy didn't come out that way, so either he had found a different way to move in and out, or he had a really good hiding place. I mean, it must have been one of those, because I know there's no such thing as any Bloody Mabel. I went to boarding school as a child. My family is pretty well off, and they've always tried to make it seem like sending me to a boarding school was the best thing for my education. Honestly though, I thought it was the best thing for them to avoid parenting as much as possible. If I sound bitter, I'm really not for the most part. Actually, I really enjoyed boarding school. However, there was one year when I was 12 that I did not have a positive experience at all. You see, there was this guy in my grade who was a bit of a bully. You know, the type that goes to a really good school and almost makes you wonder how he even managed to get himself in this place. Now, if that part makes me sound bitter, that's because I certainly was. The kid's name was Scott, and he made my life a living hell for a short period of time. Whenever he saw me, he would push me, poke me, prod me, punch me, call me every name in the book. I really couldn't understand why he'd singled me out so much for this sort of torment, because I was definitely not the nerdish or bookish type. I guess there was just something about me he didn't like very much. Our interactions probably wouldn't have gone past normal bullying if it hadn't been for one certain incident in particular. I was walking on the grounds between classes. It had been raining, so the ground was really wet and mushy. I wasn't in that much of a hurry to get to class, but I was somewhat absent-minded, so when I suddenly tripped over something and fell face first into a large puddle of mud, I was completely covered in wet sludge. I turned over and saw Scott there. He was laughing his ass off, as if he had just seen the funniest thing in his whole life. I knew I couldn't go to class this messy. I knew I had to go back to my dorm room to change all my clothes, which of course meant I would be late for my next class and would likely get demerits for it. Pissed beyond belief, I grabbed a handful of mud and shoved it right in Scott's face. Getting up, I kicked him even harder in the crotch. He crumpled to the ground, cursing at me, threatening the hell out of me too. The problem was for him, in his current condition, he wasn't going to be able to do much. After that event, I didn't even mind the fact that I was late for class. Instead, I felt really good for finally standing up for myself. I guess it was quite short-sighted in hindsight though. I honestly thought that all my problems with Scott would be ended that night. I returned to my dorm and the lights were all out. I saw my roommate was lying in bed, so I decided not to disturb him. I came in, undressed, and decided to get some rest myself. I climbed into bed and dozed off for a while. Later into the night though, something awoke me very suddenly. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but it was definitely something. I looked around the room and saw my roommate was sitting up in his bed looking over at me also. I asked him if something was wrong, but he didn't respond to me. He just sat there looking at me. After a moment, he waved me off and laid back down on the bed. I certainly thought that was very weird, but I didn't think too much of it. I dozed back off. The next time I awoke, it's because I felt someone nudging me. I opened my eyes, only to see Scott standing over me. My eyes shot over to my roommate's bed, only to see it was empty. I was going to yell or scream, but Scott put his hand over my mouth and pressed really hard against it. Then he pulled out a pocket knife. Scared, I tried screaming again. I tried to bite his hand even. I tried anything to get him off me, but to no avail. Scott flipped open the blade. Then he took the knife and slowly traced it down, stopping on my boxer shorts. "You kicked me in the balls, you know. It seems only fair I get you back." I screamed in his hand some more and tried with all my might to push him off. Fortunately though, he moved the knife away from my boxers. He brought it up to my face though and cut a little line down my cheek. I immediately felt the blood spilling out and I began to cry. "Next time it will be your balls," he said. Then he punched me in the face and warned me that if I told anyone, he would kill me and my roommate. Well, of course I told. I mean, anyone who didn't tell who had threatened them with a knife needs to have their head examined. He was picked up soon after by the campus police and got turned over to the actual police soon after. He was expelled from the school and I never saw him again. Thank God for that. I definitely dreamt of that night over and over again for years after though, and it left me with quite a scar. I remember when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, my school had a teacher's strike. It was a long one too. School was canceled every day for at least 2 weeks. When it appeared the strike was not going to end anytime soon, the school board brought in substitute teachers to teach all the classes. A lot of students were pretty pissed off that their extended summer break had finally ended. I, however, was ecstatic that I was finally getting back to class. Yeah, so I was a bit of a nerd, what of it? Well, of course, the teachers striking were pretty pissed off about the substitutes. A few of them were so immature about it, they even heckled some of the students as they were going to class. One of the teachers, we'll just call her Mrs. Lulak, took some pretty nasty things to me as I was walking by their picket line. She had sort of a reputation for being a bit of a bitch, so I did my best to just ignore her. It was really an odd way to behave towards a third grader. One of the days that I was in class, another incident happened as well. Mrs. Lulak got way too close to the building I was supposed to have been in. Her classroom had the teachers not been on strike. While our substitute was out of the room, she came right up to the open window, stuck her arm in, and acted like she was trying to grab around for something. It really scared the crap out of all of us. She fled before the substitute came back as well. All in all, a strike was one thing, but this woman just came across as mentally unbalanced to me, and this is from the perspective of a third grader, extremely mentally unbalanced. Of course, there was a boundary the striking teachers were not supposed to cross, but she had no respect for not crossing it. The strike went on for the 3rd week with more of these strange incidents occurring. I told my mom about how she was behaving, and she claimed she would call the school about it. I'm not sure she ever did though, maybe she just forgot. When I went to school on Monday morning, I noticed Miss Lulak was not in the picket line anymore. I felt a bit better about that. I even suspected that if the strike ended, she still wouldn't come back to become my teacher because of her actions during it. During the 3rd class of that day, I really had to go to the bathroom, like really badly. I couldn't wait for the normal bathroom break, so I raised my hand to see if I could go. I got permission and walked into the bathroom to one of the urinals. As I was walking to the sink though, a stall door suddenly opened behind me, and someone grabbed me from behind. They pulled me into the stall, closing the door behind us. I was startled to turn around and see that it was Miss Lulak in the boys' bathroom. She grabbed me and started to shake me back and forth. She kept on blabbering about wanting her fucking classroom back. She shook me so hard I hit my head on the wall of the stall several times. I'm sure it was then I started crying. I was completely terrified. She shoved me back against the wall, and I fell to the floor bawling. The stall door opened just then, and the custodian that was there saw what was happening. He instructed her to step back from me immediately, then put his hand out gently towards me. I grabbed it, and he pulled me to my feet and put me behind him. He let me out of the bathroom and took me to the nurse's office as well, before going to speak with the principal immediately. My parents came to the school to pick me up. My father was of course furious. He demanded that she be arrested and fired. I don't really know exactly what happened to her after that, but I do know she did not become my teacher that year, and I never saw her again after. When I was in elementary school, there was this really nice janitor that I really liked. Most of the other kids made fun of him actually, but I was never sure why they did. They told stories about him and claimed that he was mentally ill or he had escaped from the crazy house or something. I think it was because he seemed a little bit off to them. He was quiet and never responded when any of the other students were talking to him. Sometimes he would just stare at people quite blankly as well. I was the type of kid, however, who hated to see people sad. I hated to see people getting picked on for no reason. So one day, when I saw just how sad this was making the janitor, I decided to do something nice for him to cheer him up. I went out during recess and picked a couple of daisies. I brought them into the school and gave them to him. He took them, and I actually saw the man smile for the very first time. I also heard him speak for the very first time when he said thank you to me. After that, for a couple of weeks, the janitor seemed a lot different than before. He smiled whenever he saw me, and he would always say, "Hi, Jenny." I would always say hi right back to him. Some of the other kids made fun of me for talking to him, and joked that the janitor must have a crush on me. I just ignored them. People saying mean things never really bothered me at all. A few weeks after, I had the first talk with the janitor personally. I brought him more flowers from the schoolyard. This time, when I handed them to him and he thanked me, he said something else. "Hey, do you want to see where I keep all the daisies you bring me?" As he asked me this, I of course nodded and told him yes. I was pretty interested. He then told me to follow him. He led me down to the janitor's closet, which was a bit down the hall. He opened the door and turned on the light. I had given him quite a lot of flowers over the past 5 or 6 weeks. It seemed like every single one of them was in there. Somehow, he also had my school picture as well. Who knows how he got it in the first place? It was hanging up on the wall by the vase that was overstuffed with dying flowers. For the first time, I was actually a bit concerned about this guy. Before I could even say anything to him, though, the janitor grabbed me and pushed me back into the room. I fell down on my knees. He flicked the light off and for some reason closed the door behind him. I heard it lock from the outside, and I began to panic like any 10-year-old girl would in such a situation. I began screaming and crying at the top of my lungs. I ran over to the door and began pounding on it with my tiny fists and kicking it with my feet. Tears began to flow down my face. The only fortunate thing about the situation was that I was too young to have any idea what he really wanted from me in that moment. It was likely that I was only in that closed closet for a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. Eventually, I heard the key in the door, and the door was opened. Outside was the school principal and the gym teacher. Apparently, a few kids had seen him shove me into the closet and ran to get the principal right away. The principal took me by the hand and told me that he would take me to the nurse's office to call my parents. The gym teacher had the janitor by the collar and was told to take him to the principal's office and call the police right away. I was okay in the end. My mom and dad were so pissed though. They demanded the man be fired right away and put in jail. Obviously, he was fired, and I never saw him again after. I have no idea if he went to jail though. To this day, my parents won't tell me anything else about the incident, likely to protect me. This took place in February of 1988, when I was just 8 years old. I'm now approaching my mid-40s. I still have massive anxiety whenever I think back to that night. For context, I'm a man, and have always been the shortest person in my class, with the smallest body frame. I was living with my mom, my stepdad, and my older sister who was 3 years my senior. Because my parents were extremely poor, we found ourselves moving around quite a bit. At the time this story took place, we were renting out a rundown duplex in Utah. I'm fairly confident this took place on a Wednesday evening, as that was the weekday my family would gather around the television and watch America's Most Wanted. After the TV show had ended around 9 p.m., we said goodnight and headed off to our own bedrooms. It was a school night, so I often went to bed around 9 or so. Our duplex had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the main floor and 1 in the basement. My room was on the main floor, just down the hall from the living room, while my mom and stepdad's bedroom was adjacent to mine at the end of the hallway. My older sister had the lone room in the basement. At that age, I was fearful of the dark, so I often slept with my bedroom light on to allow perfect vision. Because my parents never paid their bills anyway, they never had an issue with this, as most other parents might. We had a false sense of security living in this small Utah town, so my parents never locked our front door. My mom and her husband always had a lock on their bedroom door though, and made sure to lock it every night so we kids couldn't come in unexpectedly. I remember drifting off to sleep shortly after laying down. It must have been around 1 a.m. or so, when I was abruptly awoken by a peculiar noise coming from my room. As I sat up in my bed in response to the noise, I was horrified to see two grown men sporting biker beards and easily towering 6 feet tall standing in my bedroom doorway. Again, I was able to see every detail of these slovenly men because my light had been left on. The men standing in the doorway were blocking me in my room so I could not move past them. They both had the most evil glare in their eyes that I had ever seen too. I was petrified with fear. I don't know why I did this, but in that moment of complete shock, I jumped up from my bed and onto my feet. Only then did it dawn on me that my tiny body was not going to be able to do anything to these guys. My parents' room was directly against their backs. My first instinct was to run to them and call out. Looking back now though, I realized it would have done no good because of how securely they slept, comfortably behind their locked bedroom door while this was taking place. Once my body's motions caught up to my thought process, I instead ran to the corner of my room and crouched down. All the while, the three of us were just staring at each other. I tried to let out a scream or call for my parents, but this was the only time in my life where I couldn't even make a noise. My vain attempts to scream mounted into silent desperation. I didn't know what these people wanted, and I could only imagine the worst. One of the men pushed his index finger to his lips to signal me to remain quiet. As I trembled with fear, the second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a 6-inch blade. My room was fairly small, and they were both now standing within 4 feet of me. He made sure to swivel the knife in the air to make the point he was not afraid to gut me like a fish. I swear I pissed in my pajamas. Another attempt to scream yielded nothing yet again. Shortly after, they closed my bedroom door, and I was left all alone. Instinctively, I thought they must be robbing our house, but now that they were exposed and had threatened me, they would now leave. But boy, was I wrong. I waited a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Do I open the door and try to pound on my parents' door? Were the guys still waiting for me there behind the now closed door? Who knew? After a few minutes, I gathered what little courage I could and decided to crawl back in my bed and place the sheet over my entire body and wait it out. Were they planning on killing my family? I asked myself. Did they leave yet? What did they want? My anxiety grew as thoughts continued to race through my mind. As I lay there intently listening for any sounds, I could hear them moving around the house and opening and closing various drawers. The walls were paper thin in that cheap duplex, so every move was easily heard. Next, I heard them make their way down the stairs to the basement where my sister was sleeping alone. I was listening to every frightening sound, with all hope in my heart that my stepdad would wake up. He was a fairly large and intimidating man, and these creeps weren't exactly being super quiet. This went on for nearly an hour. I was lying petrified in bed listening to every move. To my horror, my entire family seemed to be sleeping through the ordeal. After some time, I heard the front door shut once again, and the early winter sun began rising. My stepdad worked in a factory and usually woke up around 5 a.m. I couldn't wait to hear my parents unlock their bedroom door. As soon as I heard their alarm, I ran out of my room. I was hysterical, trying to explain what had happened. Next, my sister woke up. I desperately wanted to tell her what happened by herself in the basement. My parents tried their best to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face, and I had been traumatized. To my disbelief, though, my parents chalked it up to being only a bad dream. In fact, I was told this was not even possible, because if anything like that ever happened, surely they would wake up. My sister saw the desperation in my eyes and knew this must be serious. She and I went through the entire house to look for items that might have been stolen. We came across her dresser drawers left half open and many personal items out of place. This was enough evidence for her to become just as frightened as I was. Because nothing was missing from our house, though, my parents didn't even bother calling the police. I was made to go to school as if nothing had ever happened. Fast forward a couple of weeks, though, we were all watching TV together, and an update came on about a criminal being captured, featured on Most Wanted. My heart immediately sank. when I recognized the mugshot on TV as being one of the men who was in my room that night. Of course, disclosing this to my parents only made them believe me even less. To this day, I still hold some resentment towards them. While they slept peacefully behind a locked bedroom door, I was busy being victimized. Needless to say, I never sleep without locking my door from then on. Many years ago, I used to work night shift at a hotel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. During the season, it wasn't so bad, mostly just families and stuff. We also had security on site then too. However, in the off-season, the winter months, it was quite different. The cheap weekly rates we'd offer attracted a lot of creepy people. The idea was supposed to be to make money in the off-season by renting to what's known as snowbirds, older retired people who come down to the beach for a month or more during the winter. Things didn't always work out that way though. The cheap rates made it possible for a less than desirable element to become long-term residents at the hotel. In my time working there, I've discovered more than my fair share of meth labs, broken up physical assaults, and even more during the winter months. Working third shift would cause me to meet some very interesting people. The colder weather meant homeless people would often wander in, get warm, and grab a cup of free coffee. I wasn't supposed to let them, but I didn't want to be cruel. I would let them grab a cup of coffee and get warm for however long they wanted, as long as they didn't cause any trouble to anyone. As you might imagine, night shift in the winter made for some pretty crazy and sometimes creepy stories. I have quite a lot actually, but this one is one that stands out, mostly because it didn't end well for me. I'd had a pretty great night up until the point this happened. I had gone to see an indie wrestling show with my best friend before work. In fact, I had agreed to come in an hour early the next night for the young lady that worked second shift, in exchange for her working an hour late for me on this night, so I could enjoy that wrestling show. Ironically enough, I even met Terry Funk that night, a wrestling legend known for his hardcore and bloody matches. Little did I know, I was about to experience that kind of violence for real. I was supposed to arrive there at midnight, due to her working over an hour for me. I normally came in at 11 p.m., so that was about right. I counted the register, and she briefed me on her shift as to what happened as per usual. As she was leaving, my friend, who we'll call Andrew, pulled up out front. He worked second shift maintenance at this hotel, and 2 other hotels our company owned. He would regularly stop by after work and go grab us some food. We would play World of Warcraft on our laptops together after eating, if business was slow on a particular day. He was getting my money and order for food, and getting ready to leave. I was excited, telling him how much fun I'd had at the wrestling show, and showing him my Terry Funk t-shirt I was so proud of. I was just walking into the back office to put the shirt up, when I heard the doorbell indicating a customer had entered. It's true what they say. Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. I had just turned around when I heard someone say something loudly. I couldn't make out what they were saying from where I was though. As I reached the doorway, I saw Andrew fall down in front of me. Next thing I know, a man walked around the corner and smacked me in the head with a short steel pipe in his hand. I staggered in surprise and went down to one knee. The next thing I knew, he smacked me in the head with the pipe again. I could hear the other guy, who I hadn't even noticed was there until this moment, say somebody had gotten away and called a cop. They sprinted out the front door. I was able to get to my feet. I tried to call the police from my phone in the back office, but I was having issues operating it. I slammed it down in frustration. I was hurting and scared, and I was really freaking out. I realized they might come back at any moment, so I locked the door as soon as I could. I didn't know what had happened to Andrew, and that really worried me. I called 911 at about this time, as blood had started pouring down my face. I told the operator we'd been attacked, and we needed an officer and an ambulance ASAP. I then called the other hotel we ran to let the night manager know what was going on. He thought I was messing with him at first, because when we got bored, we would often prank each other. Finally, though, I convinced him I was not joking. The cops and the ambulance pulled up as I opened the door. It was at about this time I found out that after they'd sucker punched him and knocked him down, Andrew was able to jump over the desk and escape, just as a cop happened to be driving by. We flagged down for help. I ended up in the hospital ER, where I had to have multiple staples and stitches in my scalp, and they gave me morphine for the pain. I had no way to get home after being treated, but the doctors and nurses took pity on me and paid for a cab home. My plan was simply to go back to work. It was December and Christmas was coming. I had 3 kids and I needed all the hours I could get. When I got back to the hotel, the IT guy Ted was there with his wife Barbara, who also worked the front desk. She was shocked to see me. She thought I would still be in the hospital. I thought in the moment that I'd only been hit in the head once after being punched, but the video which Ted was pulling for the police showed a very different story. Apparently, I was really out of it, because after I went down to one knee, the 2 men had begun hitting me multiple times, over and over again. In the video, I kept trying to grab the pipe and get up for some reason. I don't even remember that, but I guess that was how I got to my feet. The man kept punching me and hitting me in the face with the pipe. That was until his friend told him Andrew had gotten away and called the cops. The 2 of them then ran out. I was given a room at the other hotel we owned and took a week off to heal. They switched me over to another property on night shift for a month, just in case those guys were after me in particular. We never found out why they chose to attack me so viciously. The police suspected it might be a failed strong-arm robbery, due to Andrew slipping away and me not going down, but it really shook me up not knowing. Even though I was at our other hotel when I came back to work night shift, I was extremely nervous. Every time the door chimed, I tensed up. I couldn't afford to quit though. As I said, I have 3 kids I'm supporting. They never caught the guys as far as I know. A detective stopped by about 2 months later when I was working second. He showed me several mugshots and asked me if any of them looked familiar, but I'd never gotten a great look at them as it all happened so fast. The video was not of the best quality, unfortunately. Even so, 2 of them looked very familiar to me. I pointed them out, and he asked me how sure I was. I told him honestly it was about 85% or so. Then he screamed at me and asked me if I wanted someone to go to jail for attempted murder on 85% certainty. I was stunned into silence. I was the victim here, being attacked for no reason, and he was yelling at me like it was my fault I was too busy being assaulted to get a good look at them. I no longer work at that hotel or on the night shift, and I'm glad because this is just too dangerous an area. This happened a few years ago. My aunt and uncle own a restaurant, and one Saturday they were moving from their old location to a new one. My aunt, uncle, future husband who was my boyfriend at the time, cousin, and about 10 other people who were mostly employees were helping the move since there was a bunch of large equipment to take over. We were all at the old restaurant packing things away, tying them down, when we ran out of ratchet straps. I offered to drive to my parents' house, which was about 30 minutes away, to get some more straps from my dad. Because everyone else was busy though, I had to go all by myself. On the way back, I got a call from my aunt, saying they were all going to take a load to the new location and to meet them on the way there. I didn't know how to get to the new place since I'd never gone there before, so I pulled over into a parking lot to put in the address. From the road, you weren't able to see the parking lot at all because of all the trees surrounding it. Something odd that I didn't notice at the time was that this was a sunny weekend day, but there were no other cars in this parking lot. I pulled into the parking spot and immediately grabbed my phone to put in the address. For whatever reason though, I didn't put it into park like I normally do, which means the doors were left locked. Less than a minute after I looked down, I heard and suddenly felt a huge hit against the side of my car. I remember looking up in surprise, only to see a man standing there. For For so long, I thought it was odd how I couldn't even see the color of his eyes. That's how big his pupils were. It's important to know that I was in a small SUV, so we had to bend over to look in the window. A second later, he was pulling the door handle so hard I thought he was going to rip it off like a bear or something. I was confused as to why the door wasn't unlocked as well, like it normally would be when I'd parked in a parking spot. The man got very visibly upset that the door wasn't opening, so he began to smash the side of his fist against the window, swinging his whole body over and over. Getting progressively more pissed, he moved to the door handle of the back seat. At this point, I was so scared of him getting into the car that I grabbed and unsheathed the camping knife I had in my door. When I looked back at him, he stopped attacking my car, saw the knife, and smiled. I think it was right then that I realized he did not want money. He didn't want anything sexual. He wanted to kill me. I knew that if he got in my car, it was going to be all over for me, even with this small knife. He was way bigger than me, and he was smacking the car so hard I was amazed the windows were even holding up. I guess I'd gotten comfortable with the idea he wouldn't be able to get the doors open. But after he continued bashing the back window a few more times, the car began to rock back and forth as he moved to the trunk. The panic got worse, because I knew the doors weren't opening for some reason, but maybe the trunk still would. He smashed against the back window with both of his balled-up fists, and I was afraid the window was going to crack. He was yelling something I couldn't understand. It was right at that moment I realized I hadn't actually put the car in park. I could slam it in reverse. I dropped the knife in my lap, shifted the gear into R, grabbed the wheel, and slammed my foot down. Honestly, I have no idea if I hit him or if he managed to jump out of the way, and I didn't care either. I didn't look back once. I slipped into drive as I spun around and peeled out of the parking lot. It was my first time ever ignoring a stop sign. I still have no idea why this one particular day at this one time out of all others, I decided not to put it in park. So this all happened when I was about 15 or 16 years old. It was in 2005 or 2006, I think, way before the era of smartphones. My best friend at the time, we'll call her Mona, and I were proper emo kids, and we used to love finding cool locations to take our photos. Because of this, I never went anywhere without my camera, and I used to keep it on me at all times. This will be important later. My parents' garden was pretty big for a suburban house actually. When you were sitting on the patio, you'd have a lawn on one side and a sort of jungle-ish area on the other, with some walkways going through it. I had a really strong intuition when I was younger, and I remember this one particular night when I had Mona sleeping over at my house. My dad was away in a different city for some work, and my mom had one of her friends over that night. I guess we'll call her Sarah. I just remember hanging out with Mona when all of a sudden I was overcome with this extremely bad feeling. I had this sense something was not right. Mona said she felt it too. We rushed to tell my mom and her friend who were sitting outside on the patio. I even told Sarah to not go home that night because I was scared something would happen to her on the way home. I asked my mom and Sarah if they could not stay outside for too long either. They didn't seem really concerned at all, but they agreed anyway, I suppose to humor me, and eventually came inside together. Mona and I sat on my bed for a while, looking at all the photos we'd taken that day on my camera, before I put my camera back in my bag and slid it underneath my bed. Then we went to sleep together. We were suddenly awoken at 4 or 5 a.m. though, by my mom rushing into my room to check if we were okay. Immediately, we could sense something was wrong. She told us someone had broken into the house during the night. We all started looking around to see if they had taken anything. At first, we couldn't find anything missing, but then, to my horror, I discovered that only my camera had been stolen, and from my bag as well. The bag was still there, right next to where Mona and I had been sleeping. In fact, not a single other thing was missing or moved. Not my mom's laptop or any of the expensive valuables out lying in the open, which tells me they didn't have time to look for valuables, which meant they must have been looking for this specifically. Perhaps even watching us to see where I'd hidden it, because they knew exactly where I'd put my camera. That creepy feeling we'd had all night was probably the feeling of being watched. I'm guessing whoever this creep was had been hiding in some of the bushes and watching us the entire time. I don't know what creeps me out more, honestly. The fact they were right there watching us, or the fact they were in my room, just centimeters away from us while we slept right through it. I shudder to think what would have happened if they had stuck around longer. It turns out Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, so my mom hadn't set the alarm that night. Sarah, me, and Mona all slept through the entire thing. Lucky for us, my mom is a light sleeper, and she caught the guy in our room and screamed at him to get out of the house. My mom is a total badass, and that's not the only time she scared a burglar off. The experience taught me to always trust my intuition and to always set the house alarm, no matter what the situation. If you were to ask me if I believed in the paranormal, I'd tell you that I'm on the fence about it. If someone were to tell me a house is haunted, I wouldn't believe them unless I myself experienced something out of the ordinary. I believe that creepy things do happen, but I go into situations with the mindset of trying to rule out every possible cause before I come to a conclusion. If I can write something off as just a coincidence or my mind playing tricks on me, then I will, and I'll leave it at that. This experience, though, is a little bit different. I don't know what exactly happened really, and it hasn't happened for a while since either. This night, I was on a Discord call with some of my friends. It was pretty late at night, maybe 10 or 11 or so, and I decided I'd start doing my nightly routine and get settled in for the night while on call. I muted myself and went to brush my teeth, got my pillows all set up on my bed, and went to close my blinds by my window. That was when I noticed something odd. There appeared to be a man just standing in the street under a street lamp. I couldn't really make out his face because of the distance, despite nothing really obscuring it. The man was wearing a suit. He wasn't particularly tall, and I don't know what really stood out about him, other than it being odd to see him there so late at night. Something about him was just giving me a really off feeling. I unmuted myself and sat back down at my desk, letting my friends know about this. I was joking about how his Uber was late, or his wife must have kicked him out or something. We all gave him the very creative nickname of Suit Man. After a few moments, I went back to the window to check if the man had moved at all. The man had indeed moved. He was now standing right in front of my cross-street neighbor's backyard gate, which was visible from where I was due to it being located near their garage door. The longer I looked at him, though, I noticed more and more odd things. First of all, he was not facing the gate, and he was standing completely still. Second of all, I noticed he was so still that he hadn't even triggered the neighbor's floodlights, which would automatically come on when someone or something moved nearby. Either that or they'd gone off already. You had to cross over their driveway to get to the gate, so if he'd just moved there, the lights should have been off. At this point, I was really freaked out, but also a little bit intrigued. I decided to grab my phone and try to take a picture of this man. When I turned back to look at where the person had been, though, even though I'd only looked away for a few minutes to grab my phone and pull up my camera, the man was already gone into the night. I decided, fuck this, and closed my blinds immediately. I stayed on that voice chat most of the night, since I was now a little bit freaked out still. I didn't want to try going to sleep anytime soon after such an odd encounter. Although all that was pretty creepy in and of itself, the scariest part came after. For a few months after this, I would hear someone whistling while walking down the street at the exact same time of night I'd seen the man each and every day. It stopped recently, and I haven't seen it since. nor have I seen the suit man again, but I'm hoping that will be the end of it. I was a toddler, no more than 3 years old, when my family and I lived in a small rented house in Vermont. There are a few things I remember about it. The spiral staircase, the large field outside, well, my 3-year-old self thought it was quite large at least, and the cold cement floor in my bedroom. The part of the house that I was most strangely drawn to, though, was the basement. I was, and still am, quite a wanderer, so I didn't really mind being alone. Both of those qualities made the basement a sort of getaway for me. I wasn't allowed to be down there by myself technically, but a handful of times I managed to sneak my way down without anyone else noticing. I remember crawling down the stairs like they were a ladder or something, being overly cautious of falling, as I'd done so before. Sometimes while going down, I would hear this mumbling coming from somewhere in the basement, but it was too quiet for anything they said to be discernible. When I got to the last step and turned around, I would see her over in the corner. It was a sort of mannequin with blonde hair and an expressionless face. At least, it seemed to be. All I could think is that this thing looked like the mannequins from JCPenney, or perhaps Kmart. I had never once thought this was an odd thing to be there. Some basements have exercise equipment. We had a mannequin. So what? Years later, and living in a different home, I suddenly got the urge to bring this up to my mother. "Honey, why would we have a store mannequin in our basement randomly?" My mother gave me a strange look and laughed. "We've never once owned a mannequin in any of the places we lived in." I was stunned. To this day, I have no idea who that was that I saw in the basement. I just don't know what to make of it. I only ever picked up a hitchhiker once in my entire life, but that one time was so absolutely bad, I would never consider doing it again. Hell, if I saw a one-legged war veteran walking naked in the snow trying to hitchhike, I still would not pick them up. That's how frightening this experience was for me. I was making a cross-country drive back in the 1990s. My family lived in the East, and I was living in California. I didn't really care for flying myself, so whenever I went home, I simply enjoyed a nice trip from California to Pennsylvania in my car. It was a good 4 to 5 day trip. On the second night, while I was driving through the desert at night, I noticed there was a man on the side of the road up in the distance. He was holding a cardboard sign and sitting off on the shoulder. I did think it was a bit odd to see that out in the desert, but I also immediately had some sympathy for the guy. Because of that, I stopped to pick him up. He seemed quite elated at first. He made a lot of small talk, and I asked him where I should be taking him. He said he wasn't going anywhere in particular, and if I could just take him to the next city, I could drop him off there and that would be just fine. After a short while, though, after things were settling down a bit, it was then that it began to get weird. He started saying things that really creeped me out. It began when he just said right out of the blue, "You know, you shouldn't pick up hitchhikers." I was surprised, but I asked him why he would say such a thing. After all, he was a hitchhiker who needed a ride. "Yeah, but you don't know anything about me," he responded. "You can run into some pretty crazy people out here." He paused for a moment, then laughed. I mean, personally, I'd never pick up a hitchhiker myself. I tried countering him by saying that he had no idea what kind of person the guy picking him up was either. He actually agreed with that, though. I tried to change the subject several times. I tried to ask him about why he was out here hitchhiking to begin with, but he didn't seem to really want to talk about it. After a while, he went back to talking about the dangers of hitchhiking. It was then that he said he had a question for me. He asked me, "So what would you do if I had a box cutter in my jacket and I just sorta pulled it out on you, you know?" And the question freaked me out, of course, but I didn't really want to let that show. I simply responded that I'd probably do whatever he wanted me to. I didn't want to get hurt that night. The hitchhiker laughed a little. Then he changed the subject himself. He talked about other things. When we got to the next city, he told me I could drop him off at a hotel and he could find himself a room quite easily. I agreed, ready to get him out as soon as possible. At that point, I was a bit upset. After the initial freakiness, I was so weirded out. We actually had a good conversation for the rest of the ride, though. I pulled up to the office of the hotel, told him goodbye, and he got out of the car before closing the door on his own. Before he did, though, he paused for a moment and reached into his pocket. He took out a box cutter and showed it to me, and then grinned the freakiest grin I'd ever seen. "You're pretty lucky tonight, man," he told me. "I only like people who fight back." He closed the door. I sped out of there as quickly as possible, and I've never picked up a hitchhiker since. We've all heard the old adage that you should never pick up a hitchhiker. I remember even seeing a movie about it from the 1980s, called The Hitchhiker. It scared the crap out of me, and I swore I would never pick one up. I never have, but I did hitchhike on my own once. I was in college at the time. I'd like to say that this was a time when I was studying at the library or something like that, but of course I was not. I was at an off-campus party with some friends. It wasn't even off-campus really either. It was one town over. My friend Mike had given me a ride to the party. I was definitely drinking quite a lot that night and having a ball. Before I knew it, it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, when I went looking for Mike, it turned out the damn bastard had met a girl 2 hours before and left on his own. I tried calling and texting him multiple times, but of course he was not answering. I tried to find someone else to drive me home as well, but either everyone was too drunk or they didn't want to leave the party yet. I had to get back to the dorms though really soon, because I had a lot of homework to do the next morning or the next afternoon, or it would all be late. Not knowing what else to do and not having enough money on me for a cab, I figured I'd just have to hoof it. If I got lucky, maybe Mike would get in touch with me while I was walking and come to pick me up on the way there. If not, it's not like I hadn't walked long distances in the past before. So, I set out. I was out for maybe 15 minutes or so when I saw the first strike of lightning in the sky. I groaned and tried to walk faster. I kept on hoping I could make it home before the rain fully started. I did not. About 10 minutes after I saw the first bolt of lightning, it began to lightly rain. It was then that a car came down the road. They pulled slightly ahead of me and onto the curb. When I walked by it, the guy inside offered me a ride. I wasn't sure at first. As I mentioned, I always thought hitchhiking was dangerous for either person involved. As I was mulling it over though, a loud crack of thunder changed my mind immediately. I hopped into the car, but soon after I wished I had not. The guy driving the car was extremely creepy. He kept giving me this weird-ass look, and didn't say much of anything either. I tried thanking him for giving me the ride, but he just continuously brushed me off and refused to respond to me. It almost seemed like he was uncomfortable with me even existing next to him. That made me begin to wonder why he'd even picked me up to begin with. When we were getting closer to the college campus, he asked me if I could grab something out of his glove compartment for him. I said sure. When I opened it though, I froze as I saw a large knife sitting right there. I asked him what exactly he needed from inside. He actually said to me, and I kid you not, "Could you hand me that knife, please? I'm gonna need it soon." I couldn't think of a single reason, or at least a single non-scary reason, that the man would need this knife while driving his car. I asked him what he would need such a thing for. At that very moment, he got extremely angry with me and began to yell and scream at me. "Just give me the damn knife." When I hesitated, he leaned over me and reached for it himself while still driving. I was closer to the knife though, and now I was scared. I grabbed the knife myself and pointed it at the man. He reclined to his side of the car, and I demanded he stop right now and let me out. I could see in his eyes that he was furious. He did pull over though. As I was getting out, he again told me to give him back his knife. I basically told him to fuck off and get lost. I'd leave it on the side of the road for him later, and he could circle back and get it if he really wanted it. Of course, he cursed me out. He did leave a while after. I did not leave the knife there. In fact, I threw it in the garbage when I got home. Last thing I needed was for him to come back for it and then chase me down with it. I walked the rest of the way back home in the rain, and it was a very miserable experience. A few winters back, I had a pretty horrible experience with a hitchhiker. I was out really late at night having attended a holiday party for work. While I was talking with a few people there, I noticed something that caught my eye out the window. It had started snowing while we were there. I hadn't exactly expected that to happen. I drive a Mustang which has a rear-wheel drive and doesn't necessarily handle very well in the snowy weather. I had to excuse myself from the party and drive on home early. Once I got on the road, the snow began falling heavily. The visibility was extremely bad. I had to drive very slowly to keep myself from skidding around as I was driving. A little bit further up the road, though, I noticed a figure in the light of a street lamp. It seemed to be a hitchhiker of some sort. My first impulse was to just drive right past him. The only thing I wanted in that moment was to get home ASAP. As I approached closer, though, I suddenly remembered when I was younger, and I used to go hitchhiking all the time. There were plenty of kind people in those days who picked me up and helped me out as well. Feeling a bit of sympathy, I pulled over and offered the man a ride. He was about the same size as me. I'm also a guy if you hadn't figured that out yet. The man seemed vastly underdressed for being out in this kind of snowy weather. He only had on a pair of regular jeans and a jean jacket, no gloves or anything like that. As I pulled my car back onto the road, I asked the man where he was off to. At first, he didn't answer me. He just sort of looked at me extremely strangely when I asked him. Then, when I asked him where I could take him, he responded very strangely. "Well, where are you going?" I wasn't exactly sure how to answer that. I was already regretting picking him up, and I simply told him I was on my way home. He replied, "Oh, where's home then?" I wasn't about to tell this complete stranger where I lived, especially not one who was acting as weird as he was. I lied to him and told him I lived somewhere else entirely than where I actually lived. I asked him again where he needed me to take him, and what he said next gives me goosebumps even today. "Oh yeah? Well, that's where I'm going too." He smiled at me. "What a coincidence, huh?" I was obviously startled at this point. I decided I would just drive him to where I thought I could safely let him out of the car, then drive off on my own. I drove him to the apartment complex I'd lied about living in. When I pulled in, I asked him which building he wanted me to drop him off at. He told me there was no need. "Just park where you normally park. I'll walk back to my place from there." I didn't know what this guy was up to, but I couldn't imagine it was going to be anything good. I figured I had to at least pretend to go along with it though, just to get him out of my car. I pulled into a parking spot and indicated the building I claimed to live in. I did have a plan to get away from the man, but the timing would have to be perfect in order for it to work. I opened the door and took a single step out of the car. He did too. I pretended like I was going to shut my door, but I didn't quite yet. When he shut his door behind him, I quickly hit the lock button, then jumped into my car and pulled the door closed. He turned around right away, clearly furious. It seemed my reservations about the man had been accurate. When he saw I'd locked him out, he started screaming and yelling at me. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he grabbed onto the passenger side view mirror and started pounding on my car as I pulled away from him. I made no attempt to try not to hit him, as I saw him take a knife out of his pocket and begin stabbing at my windows. He then ran it along the side of my car, scraping the hell out of it as I slowly drove away. Luckily, I got away with nothing but a very nasty and long cut on my paint job. It cost quite a bit to fix, but at least I got away without a cut on me. Before my mom married my dad, she dated a man named Craig. At first, he was sweet, but he slowly became abusive over time. My mom tried to leave multiple times, but Craig always threatened her. After one particularly violent argument, my mom waited and fled in the middle of the night. The years passed by, and she got married and had me. My dad's work included a lot of traveling, so it was mostly my mom and I at home alone in our big acreage home. I remember my mom was in the kitchen baking lasagna while I was sitting in my high chair. It was extremely hot that day, so she opened the kitchen door to let in some air. All of a sudden, she heard heavy footsteps enter the kitchen behind her. My excited mom assumed it was my dad returning and whipped around with a, "Hello, my love." Her excitement immediately turned to horror though. There was Craig, standing in the middle of our kitchen with a gun visibly tucked into his pants. Craig smiled at her and asked her what she was making. My mom mustered enough courage and told him she was making lasagna. She was physically shaking as Craig sat himself down beside me. He playfully pinched my cheek, and I remember laughing at him. My mom was holding back tears as she asked him what he was doing inside our house. Craig said he only wanted to visit my mom and he would leave after we were done eating. When the lasagna was ready, she served it to him. My mom took me and sat across from Craig so she could keep a better eye on him. He said he still had her things at his house and she was welcome to come by and get them soon. She told him she no longer needed any of it and he could simply throw it out. He started to get very agitated and said she'd thrown him away like garbage too. Craig said she was acting tough, but he knew deep down she was still the stupid little girl he had dated. He claimed my mom needed him in her life and that she couldn't function if he wasn't there to help her. He said he needed to be there to raise me because my dad was a slur who could never be able to protect my mom or I. He said if he really was crazy, he could have easily kidnapped us or done things to my mom right now because my dad was just a pussy who couldn't protect what was his. My mom started to cry and told Craig to leave right now. He said it wasn't her house anymore and he had every right to be there. My mom said if he didn't leave, she would call the police, which obviously made him angry. He threatened that if the cops got involved, he would hire people to cut her into pieces and film it as well. My mom started to cry even more. Craig then threw his plate and screamed at her to stop crying right now. I got scared and started to cry too, which caused Craig to stand up and approach my mom. She jumped out of her chair and cradled me in her arms. She begged for Craig to at least spare my life. He tried to reach over to touch my mom, but she got so scared she fell to the floor sobbing. At that exact moment, the phone began to ring. I guess Craig had become so overwhelmed or something that he just sprinted out of the house. The cops and his family found him about to shoot himself in the head after my mom called the police. His adult son had to convince him not to do it. My mom was so traumatized, she didn't want to deal with any of it. She simply got a restraining order against him. She and my dad moved across the country after. I got a bit curious recently and searched this guy up to see what he was doing. I was shocked to see he was dating a college-age girl who looked just like the woman he could never have. So this happened to me a couple of years ago, when my now husband and I were living in a townhouse in a pretty decent area. My husband was working third shift as a corrections officer at our local corrections facility, and I was working as a waitress/bartender. It was an unusually warm night for mid-March, so I took advantage and decided to take my husband's 80-pound Alaskan Malamute/Siberian Husky mixed dog on a quick walk around the neighborhood near our complex. We get to the end of the street that leads into the complex we live in. I noticed as the dog, Luke, stopped to relieve himself that there was a man across the street at the gas station with a case of beer in his hands. I had my phone out texting a friend and looked back up to notice the man was near the stop sign and seemed to be relieving himself upon it. I felt really awkward seeing this and instantly put my phone away. I hurriedly led Luke down the street on our path. At this point, I thought the guy must have noticed us. He crossed the street to where Luke and I had just been. Now I could hear him walking a few feet behind me. I just kept my head down. I pulled my phone back out and stared at it, with Luke glued to my hip. About 10 seconds later, though, I could hear the guy's steps getting faster. Luke realized the man was now behind us and stopped in his tracks. Mind you, he is a big dog compared to my 5'2" self. I can handle him easily enough, and he's very well trained by my husband. But I noticed his ears were perked up, and his tail was straight as well. I was glad he was aware of our surroundings. I wanted to keep moving, but I got this weird feeling. This guy finally caught up to us, so I tightened my grip on Luke's leash and pulled him closer to me. I stepped off into the grass to allow the man to pass us by and keep Luke out of his way. Did this guy keep going and pass though? No, of course not. When I thought he was about to go by us, I stuttered out a small apology because Luke was pulling on his leash to investigate the man. Most people were intimidated by him simply by his size. The man stopped and looked me up and down for a moment, long enough for me to smell the booze and cigarettes rolling off of him, and to notice he seemed to be in his mid to late 20s, dark hair, scruffy looking, and extremely dirty. He smiled and seemed to notice Luke trying to get at him. "Cute dog, what's his name?" He proceeded to ask me if he could pet the dog. Before I could even give him an answer, he leaned down and grabbed Luke's face. Luke surely didn't like that. He jumped at him as a warning, and the man backed up chuckling. I apologized and mentioned he was very protective, and made up a lie he had been trained as my dad's former K-9 unit. Instantly, I saw the guy's face change. I don't know how to call it exactly. He asked me what my name was, and I gave him a fake name. He then asked if I lived around here, and I said I was visiting a friend of mine for the weekend. As soon as I finished saying this, he suddenly lunged toward me. I'm not lying when I say I've never heard my husband's dog growl in the 5 years I'd been with him. But the sound that came from my dog in that moment sounded like something from nightmares. Luke's hair was standing on end, and he was throwing himself on his back legs, kicking his front legs at the man. He was snapping at him as well. The man stumbled backward, nearly dropping his beer. "Alright, well, have a nice night then, cutie." He stumbled off down the road. When I say my heart was pounding, it was deafening. I grabbed Luke's leash so hard and sprinted between the buildings until I got back to my townhouse. I locked all the doors and collapsed by the front door. Luke was in my face the whole time, kissing me and whining. He is the sweetest and most gentle creature I've ever met, and seeing him growl and react the way he did made me realize I needed to get out of that situation and fast. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.